have the honor of introducing Dr. Martha Kanter. I just really couldn't feel more honored because Martha has exemplified access, inclusion, and equity in every aspect of her career and personal life. I love the story that she ran away from home to try and figure out what life was like for people who were different from the way she grew up. We know her as the former Undersecretary of Education for the United States Department of Education. She now serves as a distinguished visiting professor of higher education at New York University's Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. Wouldn't you like to be in her class? Is it live streamed? Is it live streamed? Prior to her tenure at the U.S. Department of Education, where she focused on educational excellence and equity, she served as the chancellor for the Foothill De Anza Community College District in California from 2003 to 2009, and as president of De Anza from 1993 to 2003 in Cupertino. She holds the doctorate in education from the University of San Francisco. She has her master's from Harvard and a bachelor's degree from Brandeis, and she's now our friend, and we hope new member of ACPA. So welcome her, please, Martha Kanter.
I'm delighted to be here. I'd like to start by thanking Kent Porterfield for making the original invitation to me many months ago, and for introducing me to Cindy Love, who I'm sure will be a fantastic leader for the ACPA, and welcome my colleagues at the table, and look forward to hearing your remarks because we'll be at it all day. And what I thought was interesting was, that Kent had framed the day as a call to action. And I was thinking about all of you coming here today, and I'm very, very excited because we have so many experts in the room. And if the country would only listen to what you know, and people like me when I was in the government could take what you know and use it for improving the infrastructure and improving the strategies and all the things we do in American higher education, we would be a better country for it. And so we don't have enough of those conversations that you talked about, Cindy. And I'm hoping the day will really yield the best of what you know, so ACPA and others around the tables can really do what we need to do as a nation, which is to amalgamate this knowledge and use it far better than we have in the last century. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. I thought about how to prepare remarks on these huge topics, and I was thinking back to my now president of NYU, John Sexton, who every time we're in this conversation, he uses two words, and these are really good words to use in American higher education: complexity and nuance. And if you can't get into the deeper understandings of what access and affordability and accountability really could be for us in American higher education, and really have some kind of common understanding of the ways forward in these realms that we find ourselves in each and every day when we talk to students and when we figure out what programs to implement and which strategies to adopt and what research to read and what research not to read, it gives pause, and it makes me think about the fact that we have to have the deeper conversations to get somewhere far better than we have in the past. So in coming here, I was reflecting on my first job in education, and that was more than 40 years ago. And I was remembering when I was named the Director of School and Counseling for a local nonprofit in Lowell, Massachusetts, called at that time the Multi-Resource Services Agency. And I was remembering this because my professor at Brandeis is coming to stay with me in August, and you know how you all have that professor, right? Or many, hopefully more than one. And that's another thing. We need every student to have a great counselor, a great advisor, and great professors, and more than one. But anyway, he's coming in, and he was the one who hired me out of Brandeis, and he's he's been a psychologist working at the University of Alaska for many years. He studies the Kalahari Bushmen and other different cultural nuances about different communities. And I was thinking back to the fact that when I started, what I had was an IBM Selectric typewriter, and I don't know how many of you, it looks like sort of you're kind of at least, 10, 20 years around my age, most of you. And that was, the main way that we produced written communication to students and to colleagues. We didn't have any cell phones. The internet wasn't invented. We didn't have anything like Tumblr or Twitter or Facebook or any of that. We just used snail mail, and we used face-to-face communications. And to me, that's how, in the profession, in the student affairs profession, we educated students. We looked them in the eye, we asked them questions, we took them through deeper and deeper conversations, helped them focus, helped them learn to think critically, and hopefully came out with a better educated person during the time we had with them. And so now we fast forward, we didn't have the early alert systems then, and I don't know if you remember the assessments that I did my dissertation on assessment, and they were all paper and pencil, and they were all hand scored, and I don't know if, like you, you were excited like I was in the 1980s when we finally even came across holistic scoring, that a few people together could look at student work and discuss it and sort of put a grade on it and figure out, were they ready for college, or were they ready for this level of chemistry or mathematics or whatever. And remember when we hand scored all this stuff, they were sent to central repositories. I don't know if you all remember those days, and they would be batch processed. That was like one of my favorite words in the 70s and 80s, batch processing, waiting for the stuff to come back so we could use it, right? But when it came back, it was always too late because classes had started and the students needed the kind of counseling, and you didn't know that they didn't qualify for X, Y, or Z, so you'd have to rework the schedule, and you had long lists of students that were waiting for a better education. And this all happened, many years ago. I don't know how many of you participated in anything like arena registration. Is that name? Yes? Okay. In the larger institutions, the faculty, the professors, and the counselors, and the advisors, and the deans and administrators would run around, and we all sat on the perimeter, and like hundreds of students would come in to get registered. And, I remember one really hot day when the line was around the blocks. I mean, the lines were unbelievable, and we would be getting water, and the students would be getting more and more frustrated. And so those memories, are still very present as I think about going forward. And I also was mindful of this report I read in 1983. The 1980s in California were a time of a big fight, just like now. There seems to be like these enormous fights every decade about something or another. And at that time in the early 80s, the State Department of Finance and some other organizations in California wanted to get rid of remediation programs. And I think, yeah, you're nodding your head because you're probably in the fight. And so there was a document that was produced, which I keep somewhere in my office today, called Promises to Keep. And when you read through this document, there is a young Latina who was asked what made a difference, what made her come to college and persist and graduate. And she said this phrase that stays with me pretty much every day. I mean, I just think about this all the time in the context of the future. She said, "Someone who believed in me." And what does that really mean for student affairs? It's going to be maybe different than a professor of history or English or, mathematics or computer science. But, we are, as Kent said, in the midst of a knowledge society. And I come back to her words again and again because I think to myself, how do we give our students that systemically? How do we use what we have today in the 21st century and give our students that and give them more than just one? Not just someone who believed in me, but a community can happen for the people coming through from all walks of life, from all ages, from all cultures, from all diversities and backgrounds. But then I think we have so much knowledge at our disposal about students today and about the institutions we lead and serve. And a common thing that we say is that we don't have enough information, or we don't have the right information. And we don't have the information we need to make a better informed decision. And I think about, is that level of frustration that we feel, has that grown exponentially, which for me it has. For me, I just feel like there is so much information that I go back to a lecture I heard, and it was about selectivity being one of the key things that every person needs to really be able to do. They be able to select from all this wealth of information those things that are really important, that are going to get them to where they need to go or give them what they need to know. And I think, today we know that, for example, our assessment methods are insufficient. We learned over the last 30 years that multiple measures are better than a single high-stakes test. I mean, that seems like a no-brainer, but believe me, it isn't. That multiple measures are better than a single entrance exam or a single placement test. And I can show you study after study, evidence after evidence, and that's what's so great about ACPA, because you can pull the evidence together, and people like you who can be the experts around the country can help people understand these bigger concepts that to many of us maybe are no-brainers. But I can tell you, for the last 5 years in government, for politicians and policymakers, they don't come from your walk of life. They don't have your expertise. They don't have the information. We could even tell them on the whole issue of assessment that grades are better predictors than tests, right? And I have a friend who leads Long Beach City College in California, Eloy, I'm forgetting his last name, Eloy Oakley. And his research office just has finished a multi-year study on using grades instead of placement tests. And guess what he found? He found there was something like a 30 to 50% increase in the number of Hispanic and Black students completing English and math in the freshman year. I mean, stuff like that we're trying to learn in the 21st century. I got so excited about this, I called up, when I was in the government, I called up John Easton and Tom Brock, Tom Brock runs the National Center for Post-Secondary Research, but he was at NBRC before that. He's a wonderful, wonderful researcher. And I said, can you look at this and tell me, did they do the right things? Can you deconstruct this statistically? Can you push it every different which way? And, does it have credibility? And they said, there really is something here to look at. So this is the kind of thing that ACPA can do and help us with. But we know that grades are better predictors than than tests. And what do we have? We have a system that is imploding with so much assessment, so many tests, so many metrics. And we know when we then bubble up all these metrics into accountability systems, right? We know that the metrics are blunt. I've been saying that around the country for the last 4 or 5 years. The metrics are insufficient. The metrics are blunt. The metrics only tell part of the story when you think about nuance and complexity. And in fact, all of this, in my view, has propelled a bureaucracy that's strangling too many of us. Now, I wonder, maybe that's because, I'm in my 60s and, looking at my mother who's in her 90s and figuring out, how much can we get done in the next 20 or 30 years. But the bureaucracy has really gotten out of hand. And it's happened over decades. It's not the fault of this administration or that administration. It is the way of knowledge to become more complex and more nuanced. And we have to become smarter and more selective and more transparent and wiser because of this. So then, in that, I'm just kind of painting a backdrop for you for my real remarks, and I promise we'll be done by quarter of 10 for the panel. So I wanted to look at, as Kent and I talked about it, college access and affordability in the context of providing the kind of quality education that would lead our society, especially especially the lower sector of the lower sectors of our society, to social and economic mobility. And so then I thought back, we've tinkered with our funding mechanisms, we've tinkered with our distribution mechanisms, we tinkered with financial aid programs, but we haven't been able to, and I was in charge of this so I know, we haven't been able to simplify and make more transparent and easier to use the student loan and grant program that funds, half to 2/3 of American higher education. You either have grants or you have loans or you have a combination. Most students have a combination, and that goes into the bottom line of institutions and pays for all the things that you are doing as experts across the country. So why haven't we been able to take something like that that's so critically important? People say it's $150 to $175 billion of money. The money always changes a little bit. It's a lot of money, but it's not as much money as you might think when you work in the government. People ask me what the difference was between working in government and working at De Anza College, and I said I'm just adding 3 zeros to everything. But I'm trying to do the same things then that we did now. And so, we need to use the principles, and I call it sort of a call to action or a theory of action of, transparency and simplicity to make what we have much easier for people to use and move through and get somewhere. So for accountability, and if I will tackle I know we have Doug Letterman here, and, we'll talk about the rating system. I'm sure you'll be delighted about that. But I can't speak on behalf of government now. I'm a free agent, so. But we don't have systems that are well-designed, well understood, and incentivize the best of what we can do in education at all levels. We just don't have that yet. It's not that we don't have some. We're disappointed in the metrics. Like the metrics, for example, don't account for where students begin. So, I looked at data at the graduate school at the University of Washington in Seattle, and they've done some modeling where they put risk factors into different metrics to account for variation in student starting places, so that if you were to use student performance in evaluating K-12 faculty, you actually wouldn't be comparing a teacher in a low-performing school with a teacher in a suburban, high-performing school. A student in the lower-performing school may have, 2/3 of the students who are not on grade level. Higher-performing school, everybody's on grade level except for 5 students in the class of, 25, and blah, blah, blah. So they've done this sort of risk analysis and putting factors like that into these models. But if you look across the country and look at how we use the metrics we do have, we don't use them as well as we need to be using. And, certainly in the accountability level, we don't account for student knowledge and skill abilities when they enter. We don't look at the variation in the characteristics of our students. I fought really hard, and they're going to do this in the government, to at least pull out the Pell students and show the progress they're making. At least take large sectors of students and look at the investments on the one hand and the outcomes on the other. But all of this, more nuance and more complexity, would give us much better insight to where we need to go next, to which strategies would work, to how to really accelerate student learning and success. The indicators don't pay any attention to slashing state budgets in a given year that make you pull out, your advisors, like 20% of your advisors who are on part-time contracts anyway have to go, so students have less advising, and there might be, I don't know what, several hundred courses pulled out of the curriculum, or no summer programs, and all of this stuff that affects the metrics. If you look at graduation rates, all those external changes, like slashing state funding in a given year, impact enrollment and impact graduation rates. So there's no risk factors in any of that. And so I think my message here is that we've got a complex, diverse, and fluctuating set of understandings that tie back to the tools we have and the metrics we use. And when we combine all of that with the political decisions that get made about rating systems, historically ended, and I'm not a historian, but I guess I am by now. We've generally ended up with models that often have unintended, or in some cases, very dire consequences, pushing lots of students away. I remember, in the California state budget cuts, 400,000 students couldn't get the classes they need. And I talked to Jean Block last year as chancellor of UCLA, and I said, what are you doing about this? When you have to take, well, we're going to offer all the classes students couldn't get during the year in the summer so they can stay on track, stuff like that you have to do to better manage the institution on a day-to-day basis. And again, I'm sure the student affairs folks at UCLA helped the administration really figure out, how are they going to catch up so that they wouldn't keep losing students. And so I look at all of this after having served as your undersecretary for the last, almost 5 years, and know that even given these conditions, in every single state, in so many of our communities, we have what I have come to call islands of excellence. It's not my term, but we've got these places that somehow work, and they work really well, and they've made decisions in really hard times, and they keep pushing and fighting the fight, and imagine what more they could do with stability and funding, with stability and leadership. And so I think to myself, well, maybe one of the biggest failures in government has been not to communicate, replicate, or scale those islands of excellence, to really unpack, and this is where, again, ACPA and some of the research think tanks can really figure out, how can you take these places in the country and really understand student progression, really understand persistence and graduation rates, really understand what it took to get a stabilized enrollment-based, if you're going to be enrollment funding and not performance-based funding. How do you deal with, the new performance-based funding? I was in performance-based funding for 5 years in California. It came in, it went out. I'm sure it'll come in and go out and keep coming in and going out. But what you want is better incentives for students to succeed. That's why there's such a push to performance funding. Well, there is a negative side to that too. Money is going to create action and opportunity. But I also think, we've got to do some things differently, as Kent said at the beginning. And all of these strategies need to be tried in an experimental phase, and they need to be well understood, well researched, with an evidence base that we could grow ultimately a far better educated society. But, what would it take to help every student in K-12 be on grade level? What would it take to, stop the dropouts in the first 2 years of a college education? When you look at the federal level, the social, economic, and education policy making is fractured. Every day it's a fight in Washington about something. Today it's a fight, about, the ability of students to repackage their loans and get better interest rates. So every day there's going to be a fight. And we see the same thing in our states. You look across the states, it's a fight. But, when we look at the local level, when we look at some of your institutions, when we look at K-12 schools, we can find extraordinary results even despite all this stuff that we are exposed to. And despite what I think is what we really need, support and collaboration. Not necessarily, we always want more funding. I was in the government shutdown, which was sort of the most devastating, depressing 3 weeks I had leaving government at the end of December, but this happened in October. And we wasted $25 billion, and I thought to myself, with $25 billion, we could have got a start on the first 2 years of college being, affordable for every student, and especially for low-income families. But we sat around and wasted that money as a nation. And so what it comes down to for me is I think often we have not made the time to have the face-to-face conversations and to get people around the table to figure out what leadership can do in partnership with government, education, business, and philanthropy, and community leaders. And so, how do we get people around those tables? And I think your expertise in student affairs, you get people around tables all the time, whether it's virtual tables or real tables like this. And you know how to do that. You have the training, the education, the doctorates, the master's degrees to figure out how to bring people together lot of that because we have to really start simplifying what we have. The bureaucracy is just overwhelming. I think if you look at K-12 teachers, the morale couldn't be worse. And we've just got to get to a point of working far better together than we ever have in the past. And that means we have to listen. You don't see that in government you don't see people at a table really listening and having a conversation that actually will go deeper and deeper and get to 2 or 3 points that we could maybe all agree on, or if we disagree, we really understand where the cost benefits are and where those different disagreements are. And we've got to also, and I'll say a little bit about this, not only listen and think hard together much more, but we've got to really respect more than we disparage. And it is just unconscionable to me, the language we're using in this country at the political level, at the social level, and at levels. So given these realities, especially the internet, I think can make you anonymous. You can be even worse than you might have been when you thought to yourself. And I was reading some research about, when you think to yourself, 90% of what you say to yourself is negative, and you've got to turn that around and make what you say to yourself more positive. I don't know if you've read any of that research. But we've got to get a much more collaborative, supportive environment in which to work to give every student, what I say, someone who believes in them. So how do we do this? And I look at our nation. We've got 317 million Americans. We're going to grow a population to more than 400 million by the year 2050. We're going to have more people to educate, right? More students are going to need higher education than ever in our history. So if I've got all these PowerPoints and research for my students now that I'm teaching, and I actually should have I do have some slides if you want to see them later. I can give them to Cindy and make them available to you. But if you look at the growth, the historic growth, enrollment growth in American higher education, and then you look at the declines and you look at the growth spurts, you'll look at every single decade and even centuries, and you'll see it go up, it'll soften, it'll continue to climb up higher, higher, higher. So that's because we're going from 317 million to 400 million Americans. We're going to have more people to educate, even though we have boomers like me that are going to die large numbers, but we have more babies being born, right? And we have more Hispanic babies and Asian babies being born. White people are bearing, I think it was 0.9, and Hispanics and Asians are like 2 and 3 per family. So we're going to have more diversity in the country and more growth and more students. So when you see, and I say this to Doug, you see newspaper reporters saying decline in enrollment at St. Louis University in the year 1900, these are softening of enrollments, usually because of lack of state funding. It takes 5 years to build back when you've had horrendous budget cuts and you've done all this stuff. So if you look decade after decade, you begin to see some patterns of behavior. And that, again, is something that you all have expertise in understanding, what a pattern of behavior is and how to really think through and address better behavior over time. And that's what we need to do as a society. So it's exciting to have a conversation about this. I'm amazed at how much we were able to get done in government. I mean, when you have a 50% increase in low-income students enrolling in college over 4 years, I mean, how can you do that? And you have a 100% increase in students with Pell Grants who, from families earning less than $10,000 a year, 100% increase in just a few short years. That's pretty phenomenal. So in 2008, we had 6 million students with Pell Grants in American higher education, and today we have nearly 10 million students with Pell Grants. And part of it is the economy, it's nuance and complexity. And you should know that about 15%, I always try to think, if you were to forward fund and do what my dream is no FAFSA. My dream is you forward fund this thing. You could have taken that $25 billion and got a start on it that we wasted in October. But you could forward fund so that you could really have a college for all opportunity for every American on a sliding scale, and you could simplify the whole thing. It sounds much easier than actually doing it. You would also, reduce costs. But, when you're inside this bubble, it's very, very hard to have those kinds of big ideas and get things done when you're so weighted down with the way we always have done things. preschool for all agenda is critical. I mean, 0 to 6, I think nobody argues about that. People are going to argue about, can we fund preschool for all? Should we fund preschool for all? Well, look at the countries that have preschool for all and look at how their kids are doing. We've got, the good news is we've got the highest graduation rate in the country, and we've got more Hispanics and blacks graduating from high school than ever before. Another promising data point is that we've got 24% of Hispanics who entered college compared to, 24%, and compared to a far less number. In 2010, we had 32. In 2003, we had 24% of Hispanics entering college. In 2010, 32%. So that's a leap forward, and we need the researchers to say, you know, how much of that is just enrollment growth because we had more Hispanics coming to college, and how much of it is progression because we've done a better job reaching out from high school to college and from people that didn't get or dropped out of college or didn't come to college after they graduated from high school. But all of these statistics, when I look at it, they're catch-up statistics. They're just not good enough. And so if we are going to be a prosperous country, we have absolutely got to do much better. And I think forward, I think, okay, today we have 93 million Americans, adult Americans, who have little or no college, and 75 million of these are functioning at the basic or below basic literacy levels, if you know the adult ed group of data metrics. And that's more than 40% of all adult Americans. And given these statistics, you know, it worries me greatly that homeschooling is growing, right? Who's educating people? And, you know, you've got a third of children not ready for kindergarten. So, you know, you've got to take this sort of pipeline look at this and say, we have got to fix these problems. And there's some kind of urgency that I think all of us in this room feel about it. And we know at the, you know, at the college level, we got 40% of entering freshmen who aren't ready. But we've got tremendous innovation going on, and, you know, I think we've got people leading the way to really close the achievement gaps on the one hand and put, hopefully, more of the high-impact strategies in place. I know AAC&U has done a tremendous amount of work in this area. And I go back often, and I'll close these remarks in about 5 or 10 more minutes. If you want to take some, I'm happy to take questions if we have some extra time, maybe on the panel. But Eugene Garcia, I don't know how many of you know him. He was at Arizona State for many years. He's a professor emeritus at UC Berkeley and at Arizona State. And he wrote a paper back in the 90s called The Implementation Gap. And basically it was a paper that you can have the best evidence, and this is sort of like advice to ACPA. You can have the best evidence, the best research, and not use it for years. And, you know, we have, certainly in higher education, haven't had enough education research to compare us to, you know, NIH, NIMH. The education research funding has been a paucity compared to other professions and other investments that have been made at the state and federal level and by philanthropies. But he said, you know, basically we have got to start tackling implementation as much as we tackle the metrics and the systems and the infrastructures. So that's another thing that, you know, the research that you can provide on infrastructure and implementation. You know, why is it that people aren't using the literature we know so well? Why can't we get someone who believes in me for every student, virtually or face-to-face, hopefully more face-to-face? And, you know, I think President Obama has a great goal. I don't think anybody's disagreeing that we need a better educated society. And, you know, when I started, you know, we were first in the world in college graduates a generation ago. And this is why, you know, a historic look is so important. And when we look at the OECD information on students who were 25 to 34-year-olds, we were 16th in the world when I actually took the job in Washington in 2009. We're 12th in the world now. We're tied with France, right? We're not first in the world. We're behind Korea, Japan, and Canada. That's what drives me crazy. We're behind Canada. They have more college graduates than we do. And, you know, but the good news is we're seeing more of our institutions around the country rethinking the freshman and sophomore year. That couldn't be more important. That's a big loss for us. Those 2 years, there's actually, you know, University of Melbourne they put a big financial education part in the orientation, because they were finding out students weren't doing the things they needed to do to make sure they could finance the cost of higher education. Arizona State also did this. We're seeing hundreds of institutions rethink developmental education across the country, not putting students into this dead-end revolving door, but actually aligning the the developmental ed courses with college-level courses, and students who are too far behind, giving them intensive immersion kinds of opportunities, and students that are on the margins, that top third that are below college level, pushing them, and they're doing as well or better. So the research coming out is really exciting. We're seeing a lot of institutions embedding counseling and advising into learning communities and putting students into cohorts. I mean, that to me is a no-brainer. You all know this, but it's not done. It's only done in small portions of our institutions. We know cohorts matter. We know that good students reinforce other students who aren't maybe as performing to the level they need to. We see institutions improving their use of placement test cut scores, or even throwing out some of the bad tests and looking at grades and other things. And we're starting to even see some now new more exciting work on campuses that are giving students information about the full 4 years and even guaranteeing the cost of those 4 years. And looking at the infrastructure, the implementation models to do that, because it's very hard if you're going to lose your funding, in year 3 and you've guaranteed a cost for 4 years. But institutions are taking those risks and figuring out how to do that. We've got places like Ashland, Ohio, Ashland University. Their faculty work now for 3 or 4 or 5 years now, putting together 22 majors for a 3-year degree. How did they do that? I went down to see it, to compromise on quality. How did you, they reworked the schedule. They looked at every course. They did a deep dive into everything. They took time. They took time to work with the faculty and the student affairs folks and figure out how, as an institution, could they reform to, on the one hand, reduce cost, on the other hand, accelerate outcomes. They had good outcomes to begin with, and to actually package on some master's degrees. They did, I remember a study they did on actuaries in the state of Ohio. They didn't have enough actuaries over the next 20 years. And so they put the master's program in actuary science, embedded that with the 3-year degree program. So they've got actually a whole package. And it was interesting because I even had a conversation with the president at MIT at one point last year and said, well, what do you think is going to happen with American higher education? He said, it wouldn't be unlikely that we would be, starting in the sophomore year instead of the freshman year, and really packaging on upper, graduate programs to what we knew, because we've got so much going on in the first, so much churning and craziness going on in those first 2 years. So there's a lot of thinking about that. We've got, a competency-based degree at Southern New Hampshire University. It's a baccalaureate degree now for $10,000. How are they doing that? Are the competencies really integrated? Is it what you would call a wonderful 4-year undergraduate education? Are those students going to do as well as others? I heard the head of Anthem talking about hiring those students and the progress they're making. So I just end with that because there is a lot to learn from these places, and I think ACPA and others can take these, what I call islands of excellence, and try to help everyone, locally, regionally, statewide, and nationally, as I said at the beginning, replicate and scale and communicate what's working, so we can give every student somebody that believes in me. And I'll just end with a couple of pieces of advice. I did a couple of things on what I'd love to see going forward. If you've read the Hoxby-Turner study, I think it's an important study to read if you haven't read it. When I walk away from it, one thing they did was pushed better information to students and families. And the act of pushing better information to students and families really made a difference. Now, albeit they took, the highest performing low-income students and blah, blah, blah. They didn't take the middle class. They didn't take, truly underprepared students. But they pushed better information, and they had students selecting colleges with higher graduation rates and less debt and so on. So I think student affairs leaders can follow this research to better understand how they're impacting families student aid application, we shouldn't have that. We don't have it for Social Security. We get our letters every spring, right? How many get a letter from the Social Security Administration every spring? And you look at it and you say, oh, when I retire and I turn 66 or 70, I get this much, right? Why can't we do that for every student in this country and every family? You know, so you'd know what you'd be getting. Even though 15% of people move into the middle class, that's a good thing. I'm sure lawyers could write up 2 or 3 sentences to make sure there's some out for the government to do this. Why can't we take that crazy federal loan program, use a sliding scale, and make it 1 or 2 grants, 1 or 2 loans? It is crazy that we have so many loans. It is absolutely ridiculous. We have too many loans, too many grants, and families either don't understand or don't know about what's available, or both. And, you know, I think if we have the data jam this afternoon, is there some way to help, to figure out how to help families organize and track the debt they're assuming? You know, who is doing that in the country, and who is packaging education loan debt with car debt and mortgage debt and everything else debt? So that students and families would know going forward, these are the costs, these are the trade-offs, they could make better decisions. And as I said before, you know, our theory of action should be grounded in clarity, simplicity, and transparency. And that should drive us to really overcome these, you know, the complexity and nuance and do a much better job with the bureaucracy than we have. So I've got other things to say, but I think I'm going to stop here because it's almost 1/4 of. I have 3 last pieces of advice. I didn't say a lot about this, but I'm hoping as student affairs leaders, the one thing that I think is so essential, and I talked about the conversations and all of that at the beginning, is to build a relationship with student affairs. And what that means for you, because you're all, you know, leaders at your institutions, it means having time with that provost or that VP or whoever it is over on the academic side to figure out where we go next. Those conversations don't happen enough. They don't happen regularly enough. You can help them with understanding who are the new majority populations that we're serving, what do the students need, how do we change degree requirements, simplify articulation, all that stuff that's in your realm that they are just talking about, you know, how to get these faculty doing the kinds of things we need on the research side, and the teaching side, and the service side. And those conversations are essential. Second, keep the institutions focused on serving the whole student. And by that, it's very hard. It means paying attention to affordability. It means paying attention to the direct, incidental, and external costs of education. You know, the car breaks down, the student doesn't come to school, right? So set up an emergency loan fund. It means getting rid of those barriers to access, retention, and persistence. And it also needs, you know, as I said at the beginning, how to give every student somebody who believes in me. And then lastly, you know, let's improve these accountability mechanisms and widely share them. There are voluntary systems that need to be looked at, but an education is needed about the metrics, and you can also do that with your research backgrounds. I want to just finally express my appreciation to ACPA for having me this morning. Thank you for being the experts that you are and the leaders that you are. You have the best ideas. We're going to have a chance at the end of the day to really work through and think about what could those ideas be and how could ACPA on your behalf take a leadership role to get more done than